What was really sad to me was when we interviewed, and we couldn't get everyone in the film, of course, we only feature 4 stories, but when I interviewed most of these people, one of the questions that I asked off record, off camera was, so you're here illegally, you're sending all this money back, you're making all this money. How do you feel about the United States?
Hey, welcome back, everyone. I'm sure you've all seen the stories about what's happening at the border. Biden is allowing more illegal immigration in, not just legal immigration, stopping the building of the border wall. Now, a lot of people, when they see this, some of them think that maybe this is helping minorities, helping people seeking a better life. But that's not always the case. And actually here to speak with us about the real situation of many people who are trafficked and who deal with the very dangerous, sometimes, attempts to cross the border illegally, we have here to speak with us Namrata Singh Gujral. She's an award-winning filmmaker, and she made the film America's Forgotten, talking about this issue. Hey, Namrata, real great having you on Crossroads.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Now, you touched on a pretty sensitive topic, but you really touch on it from the human perspective of what people actually go through when they try to cross the border illegally. And it's a very interesting approach because you really show the abuses these people face and the dangers they face. And you actually spoke with a lot of them as well. Why don't you tell us briefly of kind of your general impression of what you've seen through your reporting?
So first of all, for your audiences, I'll just say, in full disclosure, I'm a registered Democrat. I actually work with content that is more humanitarian in nature. I have done pictures on LGBTQ rights. I have done pictures on a woman's journey through cancer. I mean, aside from my Bollywood campy comedies, I do pick content with very humanitarian roots. This picture, actually, when I started, came from in my mind at the time, a very humanitarian angle, which was the poverty and persecution that people face around the world that forces them to make these illegal, horribly dangerous treks. We had an entire crew lined up back here in Hollywood. The first set of shots were in India. And as I sort of started to investigate and film further around the world, I realized that the picture that I was seeing through my lens was not essentially the picture that I had in my head. And the stories just weren't adding up. And I think in a nutshell, what I realized was 2 things. One, that there's a serious abuse of America's very generous asylum and refugee policies. And second, it helps no one, not Americans, not the ones who vote for this either. By the way, those are probably hurt more than the ones who don't vote for illegal immigration in a positive way. And also largely migrants, because there's a lot of deaths on this border. There's a lot of deaths on the way here. There's a lot of sex trafficking, human trafficking, and human rights abuses. And I think as a party, the Democratic Party, if we're to be humanitarian, we should be all up in arms about this, let alone signing this in the first week that President Biden is president.
Now, I know you've spoken to some people. What have you actually seen with people, first of all, maybe why they want to cross the border illegally rather than go through the normal ports of entry? Because as you mentioned, we have a pretty generous system in terms of legal immigration.
We have a very generous system. However, the generous system was set up for people. For example, let's just take the example of, asylees and refugees, right? It was set up for the downtrodden. When we say, give us your poor, you're hungry, you're tired, it was meant for the poor, the hungry, the tired. The problem is, as we see in America's Forgotten, it's not the poor, the hungry, the tired that are actually coming and seeking asylum. In fact, we went to some of the slum areas in India and talked to some very poor folks in India who are perfectly content to be there. We talked to them in Central America, perfectly content to be there. The people who are actually coming here don't actually qualify. Did you know that 90 to 95%, this is sort of a loose number, of people that seek asylum at our southern border do not qualify? So, and the overstay tourist visas and all of the other ways that people come in. So the answer is not so much that they just prefer to do it illegally. The answer is they don't qualify for the legal immigration. And my point is, if you don't qualify, Why would you risk yours and your family's lives to come here just so you can have a better car or give yourself a lifestyle upgrade?
Well, and that's a very different take than what a lot of us hear, because we're told that these are people who are facing persecution of the country, they're facing gang violence, and you're saying that actually a lot of them, 95%, don't actually qualify for asylum status because of that. Now, I know there'd be two perspectives on this. Some would say, well, is our system of identifying what would constitute the need for asylum too strict, or are these people actually just not really in need of that? What have you seen?
I think that so this is a fact. The United States is the largest recipient of immigrants. I am one, by the way, a very proud immigrant many years ago, but I am the largest recipient of immigrants and other sort of help seekers, if you will, from around the world. So I don't know that we're too strict because we are the largest recipient. I mean, we actually not only are our policies pretty generous, but I would say that the fact that we don't enforce those policies, I mean, it's just like a free for all. So I don't think our policies are too strict. But look, at the end of the day, I very much consider myself a humanitarian, but here's the bottom line. The entire world would love, in a sense, if you live in the third world, you would like to come to the West because, and this is something we talk about in the film, it's called dollar dreams. When you take a dollar and you send that back to India or Philippines or Central America, Honduras, Africa, that dollar equates to a lot of money back in the home country. And so immediately you have sort of turned your socioeconomic status, you have jumped up that rung by about 3 scales. So that's basically the big reason that we found that people want to come is, and a lot of these people, I just wrote an op-ed for a newspaper. What was really sad to me was when we interviewed, and we couldn't get everyone in the film, of course, we only feature 4 stories. But when I interviewed most of these people, one of the questions that I asked off record, off camera was, so you're here illegally, you're sending all this money back, you're making all this money. How do you feel about the United States? What is your thought on the US? How do you feel about America? And pretty much every single, I would say 9.9 out of 10, not even 9, said, you know what, I still affiliate with the country of my home birth. That is my country. America is just somewhere I live, so I can make this money. And that's the other thing that's very disturbing to me is America's not a commodity. We're not on the stock market, and we don't just buy and sell as we please. A lot of people died for this country and died for where we are. And for us to be somehow encouraging people who think that way and just want to use it, abuse, I'm not okay with that.
Now, the other big issue here is the issue of course, people choosing the illegal path of entering the country, and where the government is actually encouraging this to some extent by making public statements about it, by offering programs and benefits to people who do come here illegally, to the extent that a lot of people who come legally have problems with it, even including in a lot of the Hispanic communities, people I know. They feel that they had to go through so much to become citizens and to go through the legal route, and other people who pretty much come in illegally and use the system as they see it, they feel that they actually get more benefits if they break the law. What have you seen with this?
So I actually have a very sad tale from when I was shooting America's Forgotten that sort of exemplifies the answer to the question that you asked. So one of the stories that I wanted to feature in that film, because I shot a lot on Skid Row and I shot a lot about the poverty in the United States. I'm actually very invested in poverty in the U.S. personally. I'm sure most of us are, even though one party probably gets more kudos over it than the other. But I think pretty much all of us, I think Americans are good, generous people for the most part. And I think we're all invested. None of us want to see Americans on the streets, hungry, poor, not getting their next meal, right? I don't think that's much of us at all. And in filming this, the other thing I wanted to sort of share was the healthcare disparity, which has become a big deal in today's world. There was a report out today from the Physicians Organization talking about coronavirus and how the U.S. could have saved 40% of the people had we not had health disparity. Now, here was my thing. I actually went to the largest community hospital in the county of Los Angeles. And I was there with my crew all day, simply looking to recruit someone whose story I could tell. I couldn't find a single person. Ultimately, I just thought there's something wrong with this. So I just went in and I spoke to the folks there and I said, I can't find everyone who comes in there. They're like, well, I am, for example, from the Honduras, and my mother got diagnosed with, and by the way, I'm a 2-time cancer survivor, so I take this very seriously, and I speak this with the utmost respect. My mother is going through breast cancer, and she's getting terrific treatment here. And so it just wasn't adding up. And so ultimately, I ended up talking to some folks who represent people for Medi-Cal, which is something we have in California. And it turns out it's the illegal immigrants get the care at all of you and certain other and pretty much all other community hospitals. The folks that fall through the cracks are the people that barely make enough to not qualify. So they are citizens, in which case they're on record. Their salaries put them just a little over the cusp to where they don't qualify for the services, but they can't afford their insurance either. And they are stuck and can't get care. And those are Americans.
And I know that's actually typically middle-class Americans who fall in that. Yeah. Now, one thing you talk about in your film is the unintended consequences of illegal immigration. What are the unintended consequences? Because I would argue most people who support these types of programs are genuine humanitarians. I think a lot of them really believe that advocating for looser immigration policies actually helps people. And you're saying that unintentionally there are consequences. What are these?
The unintended, the first one is death on the border, death on the treks here. So I don't know if your viewers have watched the film, but in America's Forgotten, we talk about the different parts of the world and how much it costs to get to the U.S. So, for example, from India, it's anywhere from $75,000 to $80,000 per person. From Africa, it's anywhere from $45,000 to $50,000 to the U.S. And to Europe, it's a little bit less. It's about $25,000 to $30,000. Equated in dollars. From Central America, it's close to about $12,000 to $15,000, and from Mexico, it's a little bit less. It's about $8,000 to $10,000. We'll start with that. So one of the things that we talked about in the film was a Time magazine article. So now Biden is talking about foreign aid, for example. There's an organization called USAID, and they set up banks to help Central America sort of come above this poverty line and help them build their economy. Do you know, and this is a Time magazine article, this is not me saying this, there are banks in Central America today that are lending money to Central Americans to make that trek to the U.S. illegally. And where's that money going? The money goes to coyotes and cartels so they can be brought to the U.S. These are USAID banks giving money to pay the coyotes. So that's one thing. So it starts there. A lot of these people loaning and selling their ancestral property and their land to also sort of put money toward that trek. And why? Because they're told when they come here, there's a pot at the end, a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and life is going to be great. We'll talk about that in a second in terms of how they use this to mislead people. And then let's talk about the trek. So the trek to the U.S. actually goes through several different countries, particularly if you're coming from Africa or India. They land in Ecuador, and then it's through several countries in South America until they get to the border. The women are raped. 1 in 3 women that end up in a caravan or on a small batch that comes here is sexually abused. 1 in 3 women. So for every 3 women that come here, 1 is raped and sexually abused. Children, there are children, minors, that are raped and sexually abused. This is in America's Forgotten. We actually talked to one of them. And then you're talking about making that trek across the desert where a lot of people dying of dehydration, dying of lack of nutrition. That's how the story started. A 6-year-old died at our border of dehydration.
The 7-year-old girl died in the desert.
From the country of India.
And I saw that, Julian Castro talking about that on the first Democratic debate, and I wanted to follow that story, and that's how America's Forgotten was born. These are just some of the stories. And then let's talk about once they get to the side of the border, they're living in complete sort of fear, if you will. And one of the ladies that we talked to in America's Forgotten When the minimum wage here was $6.25 an hour, they would pay her $1.25 an hour. And I think the sad part in all of this is corporations make out like bandits because they can get very cheap labor. But who gets hurt is the migrants and the low and middle class Americans. I actually interviewed some very well-known journalists out of India for America's Forgotten, the original picture, because like I said, I'm making a sequel now. And one of the journalists is with a newspaper called the Indian Express. It's one of India's largest newspapers, probably the largest. And so she has a lot of connections. She actually got me in touch with some of the local coyotes. And it was, they didn't want to be recorded on camera, but I was grateful that they would even talk to me, not because I like what they're doing, but it was important to be able to get that story. And here's what I will tell you. This was 2 days after that first maybe 4 days after the first Democratic debate. And part of that debate was the host asking the 9 candidates on the stage if they would give free health care to illegal immigrants. And every single one of the candidates, including President Biden, Bernie Sanders, all of them, Elizabeth Warren, at the time, Julian Castro, everyone raised their hands, every single one of them. Now, that's a very noble sentiment, right? You would think that as a humanitarian and as a Democrat. The problem is, this is where my journey in terms of doing a pivot started. When she set up these interviews with the coyotes, and I went to interview the coyotes, this was in some remote village in the foothills of the Himalayas, the coyotes were laughing, and they actually showed me a clip, just that little clip of the host asking about the illegal immigration, everyone raising their heads.
Raise your hand if your plan would provide coverage for undocumented immigrants.
This is the only clip they had. They were showing this to prospective buyers and saying, okay, we're running a special right now. Instead of $75, you can give us $50,000, and then we'll get you to America, and you and your family can have free health care forever after. And that day when I interviewed them, they had 2 people who bought into it and gave them $100,000.
And one thing you mentioned too is that there's a lot of deception involved, even with what they get once they do arrive here. Because as you mentioned, the big corporations, as you described, they tend to pay these people less money. And it seems to be almost a racket based on kind of how it's been described. What do you see with this in terms of how the corporations and even some of the companies that pay these people less money tend to operate and view this?
One of the folks that I'm featuring in the sequel is a very well-known employment attorney who has actually taken on the cause of the American worker to speak to the big corporations. The problem, and they actually lost in court. The reason they lost is because it's legal. So I think the culpability, much as I think ethically and morally, big corporations are wrong. I mean, Disney is in news today with deplatforming their actress from The Mandalorian for a tweet. And yet Disney is, the stories are abundant with Disney laying off workers and actually training their workers from overseas who will work for half the money. So that's just a little trivia for your audience. But I think the culpability, much as the moral and ethical culpability lies with the big corporations, I think the ultimate culpability lies with our lawmakers and on both sides of the aisle. Why is this not tackled in a responsible fashion? Why does this have to be where you come, and this is a party that I've supported for years. Why do you have to come in office and instead of taking care of coronavirus and all of the other issues, joblessness that's facing America, why do you have to come and immediately sign orders to turn our borders into open borders? Can you please educate yourself a little bit and then make an informed decision? I'm not saying don't do it. But look, if I found all this stuff when I was investigating, at least make the effort. At least make the effort to do the right thing by the people that voted for you.
Now, I'm actually curious too, because I know you've traveled to a lot of these countries where a lot of the illegal immigration is coming from. I'm curious what you've seen on the local impact of this, because I think there's 2 perspectives on it. One is people spend a lot of money, which doesn't go to local economies, but maybe they send money back, which benefits the local economies. But I know I've been following this issue for a long time too, going back and reading some of the older stories a few decades ago of the impact of illegal immigration on like Mexico. That you had villages that had no young men, basically, and a lot of kids growing up without fathers and wives raising their kids without the fathers there because they were here working. And it really talked about the negative impact that it was having on a lot of the communities. What have you seen in terms of this, though? I'm curious what you've seen on the ground in terms of how this actually affects these communities in other countries.
So I'll go back to a term that was coined decades ago, and the term was brain drain. And this was particularly out of South Asia, India, Pakistan, and some of those countries. And brain drain simply meant a lot of the people that were actually physicians or software engineers coming to the West, not just the United States, but even UK and parts of Europe and Australia, and sort of taking that expertise out of India. So that's one part of it. My understanding, and I'm not going to say this for a fact, my understanding is that the current government in India, for example, the Modi government, is in favor of it because some of the ways to streamline and channel the money back to some of these countries has vastly improved in the past few years. So ultimately, the money does come back, and it's amazing how much money comes back into just India, for example, as a result of the folks that move overseas, say just to the US with H-1B visas. I will tell you that since I'm in the entertainment industry, it's something I talk about at the panels I speak on. But there are pictures coming out of India right now, movies, because Bollywood makes a lot of movies in a year, pictures coming out of India that today are doing multi-million, maybe even closer to $1 billion in a couple of cases, dollar business, that if they were released about 15 years ago, I doubt they would have even broken $200,000. And that's the number of the immigrant workers that we have. That's just one country from India to the US. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing because those people didn't really do anything wrong. If the corporations are misusing our legal framework to bring people in, you know what? I'm not blaming the immigrant for that, by the way. That being said, on the ground, here's some of the negatives. So one of the ladies that we interviewed in America's Forgotten, her father was very sick. She couldn't leave. And her father, actually, she speaks about this in the film. Her father wrote her a letter and said, I'm very sick, but do not come because you don't have papers, right? That's how they say it. She didn't go. Her father was sick for about several years and finally passed away. And she was crying in the film talking about that. There's a guy we talk about in the film who spent 20 odd years in the United States. He actually ultimately did go back. When he left India, his kids were just little kids. When he went back, they didn't even recognize him. They were older adults. So there's a familial negative factor that happens here in terms of your emotional drain that happens to these societies and to these communities. And then, look, I think that it's great that they're able to send the money back and they're able to help their countries in the ways that they can. But there's a better way to do this. And we talk about that in America's Forgotten. Dubai and the United Arab Emirates are far ahead of us with all of this. They get guest workers who come, work, make a good living, send some of the money back, but they're not allowed to partake in the welfare benefits that belong to the citizens. And ultimately, there's no pathway to citizenship. They go back to the countries. But in the meantime, they've sent that money back because they're going back. They've built a nice home. They've employed local construction workers. So in a lot of ways, they've helped their economy. They've helped the United Arab Emirates, and everybody wins. And it's a very simple solution. I mean, I didn't come up with that. Someone in the UAE government did. And I can't imagine that our politicians are so stupid that they can't even take a model and follow it, let alone make one themselves.
And, I've actually read, just going back on some of the early arguments that were taking place when you had a lot of the early stages of illegal immigration from Mexico, for example, to the U.S., was that it changes from what, and correct, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on this, but from what I read, it changed in a lot of these countries the financial dynamics, where, you'd think money coming in would benefit them, but it only benefits the people who do have family members who leave and send money back. And so prices of products go up because people are able to afford it. And then it creates a dynamic where, as a person, you have three choices. You either illegally immigrate or have a family member do it, as almost like you have to because of the way the prices change, or you live in poverty, or you get involved in crime. And it creates these two divergent systems where if you want to have money, you either illegally immigrate or you get involved in crime or you just accept poverty. Is this an accurate picture in terms of what you've seen?
It is definitely a part of the picture because you create a bubble with this inflow of American dollars, the dollar dream, as they say, the term that's been coined, with the dollars that come in, and they create sort of like this this bubble. And you're 100% right from that perspective. You're either a part of that bubble. So, like for example, I'll give you an example. There's places in Central America, India. Actually, there's a little region in Pakistan as well. These are places where literally every home has one person who has illegally immigrated to somewhere in the West, whether that's, and Australia is they consider that as part of the West. So Australia, Europe, United States, Canada, a little bit less. Believe it or not, Canada is actually stricter in a lot of ways on their immigration policy than we are. You'd never think that, but they actually do a better job. It's more merit-based. It's actually a little bit more smarter. But yes, that is definitely a part of it, what you mentioned. It does create this bubble that is then very unfair to the people who don't want to partake in those choices in life.
Now, just a last question, based on your research, based on, I guess, what doing this film and seeing what you saw and then changing some of your perspectives and now wanting to do new film, if you were to tell people one thing in terms of what you've seen and what makes you want to continue on this topic, you're doing a new film now, what would you tell them?
When I made America's Forgotten, and after I came back and I realized that the ending was not going to be what we in Hollywood wanted this ending to be, I actually reached out to my entire crew and I said, this is not what the investigation has led to. The picture is actually going to end with a conclusion that discourages illegal immigration. I gave all of my crew a choice if they wanted to still have their name, because they'd already worked on the picture, if they wanted to have their names associated. And I don't blame them. No one did, because as we know, Hollywood can be punitive. So basically, I think this is the first picture in the history of cinema where there's only one name associated with the picture, which is mine. And when I did an interview with Newsweek, and they asked me why I decided to do that, why not just leave it anonymous? And I think that was a really good question, because I truly had to do some inner soul searching. And what I realized was country before career. You've got the Pat Tillmans of the world who give up multi-million-dollar, packages to go overseas and fight for what we believe in and fight for our country. This is a country that has produced some very great patriots over time. And I don't believe that just because you're a Democrat, you can't love this country more than your party. I absolutely love the United States more than I, at this point, love my party. And my goal is to bring this issue to light to the extent that I can, to where we can have a responsible conversation in the U.S. and immigration reform, but not the way it's being done right now from one side, and immigration reform that truly makes sense for Americans. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying America first. I think that is a responsible thing to do. And that's why I continue this.
Okay. Namrata Singh Gujral, thanks again for being on Crossroads.
Pleasure's all mine. Thanks for having me.